Brandon Whitmore had spent 15 years deciding who deserved luxury with a single glance. But before the next sunrise, the quiet woman he dismissed at his front desk would leave his entire career hanging by a thread. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Rain hammered against the towering glass entrance of the Beaumont Grand Hotel on West 57th Street, while black SUVs lined the curb beneath the glow of gold-trimmed lanterns. Inside, the lobby shimmered with polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the soft echo of piano music drifting from the cocktail lounge. Women in designer gowns crossed the room with champagne glasses in hand, while businessmen in tailored suits laughed beneath the warm amber lights. Every inch of the hotel whispered old money. Then the revolving door slowly turned again. A woman stepped inside alone. Her beige wool coat was damp from the rain, and the brown leather suitcase she carried looked older than some of the employees working the lobby that night. She wore no diamonds, no visible designer labels. Just a simple silver watch beneath her sleeve and a calm expression that barely moved as she paused near the entrance. Several guests glanced at her before quickly looking away. One bellman frowned slightly, assuming she was lost. Behind the massive front desk, Brandon Whitmore adjusted his cufflinks the moment he saw her. At 46 years old, Brandon carried himself like the gatekeeper of Manhattan wealth. His dark navy suit was custom-made, his smile carefully rehearsed, and his patience for people he considered beneath the Beaumont Grand was almost non-existent. He watched the woman approach the counter with slow, measured steps. "Good evening," she said softly. "I have a reservation under Evelyn Harper." Brandon's fingers stopped over the keyboard for half a second. His eyes moved from her wet coat to the worn suitcase beside her shoes. Around them, the lobby continued humming with expensive conversations and quiet jazz. But something in Brandon's expression shifted immediately. Disapproval, calculation, judgment. He typed her name into the system, then leaned back slightly in his chair. "You booked the penthouse executive suite?" he asked, unable to completely hide the disbelief in his voice. Evelyn gave a small nod. "That's correct." Brandon let out a short laugh through his nose. Nearby, a wealthy couple waiting for the elevator exchanged amused looks. "Ma'am," Brandon said carefully, "that suite runs $12,000 per night." Evelyn's expression never changed. "Yes," she replied calmly. "I'm aware." The silence that followed felt strange, heavy. Even the young receptionist beside Brandon lowered her eyes toward the monitor, clearly uncomfortable. Brandon folded his hands together slowly. "I'm afraid there may be an issue with your reservation." Evelyn looked directly at him for the first time. Her eyes remained steady, unreadable. "An issue?" she asked. Brandon gave a polished smile that barely concealed the contempt underneath it. "The Beaumont Grand maintains certain standards for our premium guests." A hush quietly spread across the front desk area. The piano music continued somewhere deeper in the lobby, but the tension near the counter sharpened instantly. Evelyn rested one hand lightly on the handle of her suitcase. "I see," she said softly. Brandon leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to sound insulting without appearing rude. "Perhaps a smaller hotel would be more appropriate for you tonight." For the first time since entering the building, Evelyn's gaze lingered on him for several long seconds. Then she asked one quiet question that made the young receptionist beside him suddenly stop breathing. "Mr. Whitmore, are you absolutely certain you want to do this publicly?" For a brief second, the marble lobby of the Beaumont Grand became completely silent. Brandon Whitmore held Evelyn Harper's gaze with the cold confidence of a man who believed the room would always stand behind him. Around them, the crystal chandeliers reflected across polished floors while rainwater dripped softly from the edge of Evelyn's coat onto the marble beneath her feet. The wealthy couple near the elevators slowed their conversation just enough to listen. A bartender farther across the lobby paused while polishing a glass. Even the piano player seemed quieter somehow. Brandon straightened his posture behind the front desk and forced a thin smile. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "there is no need to create a scene." Evelyn's expression remained calm. "I am not creating one," she replied softly. "I made a reservation." I am simply asking you to honor it. Brandon tilted his head slightly, almost amused by her composure. The executive penthouse is reserved for guests who meet certain financial qualifications. Evelyn glanced briefly at the monitor beside him. Then perhaps you should review the reservation more carefully. The young receptionist standing beside Brandon felt her stomach tighten immediately. Her name tag read Lena Brooks, and unlike Brandon, she had not missed the strange details from the moment Evelyn arrived. The vintage silver watch, the unusual confidence, the absence of embarrassment. Most people who were denied service at the Beaumont Grand either became angry or apologetic. Evelyn Harper became neither. She simply stood there with the stillness of someone entirely certain of her place in the world. Brandon typed again, this time more aggressively. His jaw tightened when the reservation details appeared once more on the screen. Lena noticed his eyes narrow at something written under the booking profile, but before she could read it herself, Brandon quickly minimized the page. Unfortunately, he said louder this time, your card has not yet been authorized. A quiet murmur spread nearby. The wealthy woman by the elevator smirked openly now. I knew it, she whispered to her husband, loud enough for others to hear. Evelyn slowly reached into her coat pocket and placed a black credit card on the marble counter. The metal edges caught the chandelier light for only a moment before Brandon looked down at it. Something flickered across his face. Confusion, then irritation. He recognized the card immediately. Very few people carried one. But instead of reconsidering, his pride pushed him deeper into the performance he had already started. That card does not change hotel policy, Brandon said. Lena's eyes widened slightly. She knew he was lying. The card changed everything. Evelyn folded her hands gently in front of her suitcase. You are making a mistake, Mr. Whitmore. No, Brandon replied sharply. I am protecting the standards of this establishment. The words echoed harder than he intended. Several guests now openly watched the confrontation unfold. A man near the concierge desk quietly took out his phone. Somewhere behind the lobby bar, silverware stopped clinking. Lena swallowed nervously. She wanted to say something. Anything. But Brandon was the general manager, and everyone inside the Beaumont Grand knew what happened to employees who embarrassed him publicly. Evelyn looked around the lobby for the first time. Her eyes moved across the chandeliers, the towering flower arrangements, the polished brass railings, and the guests pretending not to stare. Then she looked back at Brandon. Very well, she said softly. Brandon gave a satisfied nod, believing he had won. But then Evelyn calmly slid the black card closer toward him across the marble counter. Since you seem concerned about qualifications, she said evenly, please run the card publicly so everyone here can see whether I belong in your hotel or not. The black card rested on the marble counter between Evelyn Harper and Brandon Whitmore like a challenge neither of them intended to withdraw. Reflections from the crystal chandeliers shimmered across its metal surface while the silence around the front desk grew heavier with every passing second. Guests who had been heading toward the elevators now slowed deliberately, pretending to check their phones while listening closely. Somewhere near the lounge, a waiter carrying champagne flutes paused beside a marble column. Brandon looked down at the card again. He recognized it instantly, and that recognition unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Very few people in Manhattan carried invitation-only cards like that, but admitting uncertainty now would mean surrendering authority in front of everyone watching. His pride would not allow it. You want me to run the card publicly? Brandon asked with a faint smirk. Evelyn's posture never changed. You seem very concerned with appearances tonight, she replied softly. So yes, please do. The wealthy woman by the elevator laughed under her breath. This should be interesting, she whispered to her husband. Lena Brooks felt heat rising in her chest. Every instinct told her the situation was spiraling somewhere dangerous, but Brandon's expression had already crossed into something personal now. He was no longer protecting hotel policy. He wanted the room to watch this woman fail. Brandon picked up the card slowly between two fingers. Of course, he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Transparency is important at the Beaumont Grand. Evelyn remained perfectly still, not embarrassed, not nervous. That calmness disturbed Lena more than anything else. Brandon inserted the card into the payment terminal. The machine processed for several long seconds. The faint electronic tone echoed across the counter while everyone nearby watched the screen. Then Brandon's eyes narrowed slightly. Approved, A tiny flicker of surprise crossed his face before he quickly masked it. Lena saw it clearly. So did Evelyn. But Brandon forced a short laugh and removed the card anyway. Interesting, he said. It appears the card itself is active. Evelyn extended her hand calmly. Then there should be no problem. Brandon ignored the gesture. However, he continued smoothly. The Beaumont Grand also reserves the right to deny accommodations if management believes a guest may create issues for other patrons. Several people nearby exchanged looks. Even the wealthy couple appeared slightly uncomfortable now. The excuse sounded thinner than before. Evelyn studied him quietly for a moment. You already made your decision before I even spoke, she said. Brandon leaned against the counter slightly. First impressions matter in luxury hospitality. Lena glanced toward the computer screen again. A small gold symbol remained blinking beside Evelyn's reservation profile. She had never seen it before during her 2 years at the hotel. Curiosity finally overcame her fear. Very carefully, she leaned closer to the monitor while Brandon addressed the crowd around him with another polished smile. Then she saw it. Under the reservation details was a line written in bold private notation. Executive ownership, circle clearance required. Lena's stomach dropped instantly. She had no idea what it fully meant, but she knew one thing immediately. Guests were never marked that way. Brandon noticed her expression and quickly shifted the monitor away from her view. Problem, Lena? He asked coldly. No, sir, she answered quietly, lowering her eyes. But her hands had already begun trembling beneath the desk. Evelyn noticed that too. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across Manhattan while rain streaked against the towering lobby windows. The hotel suddenly felt smaller somehow, tighter, as though the entire room were moving towards something unavoidable. Brandon slid the black card back across the marble counter at last. I think this conversation has gone on long enough, he announced. Then he turned slightly toward the security desk near the entrance. Frank, he called out firmly. Please come escort Ms. Harper off the property. The words hung in the air like a final judgment. Please come escort Ms. Harper off the property. Security guard Frank Delaney looked up from near the entrance immediately, clearly uncomfortable the moment he realized the entire lobby was watching. He was a large man in his late 50s with tired eyes and silver hair at his temples, and unlike Brandon Whitmore, he had worked long enough in Manhattan to understand that wealth did not always announce itself loudly. Still, Brandon was his superior. Frank slowly walked across the marble floor while the soft sound of his shoes echoed beneath the chandeliers. Evelyn Harper did not move. She stood quietly beside her worn brown suitcase, while dozens of strangers watched her as though she had become part of the evening entertainment. Some guests openly stared now. Others whispered behind raised glasses of champagne. The wealthy woman near the elevator gave Evelyn a look of cold satisfaction, as if the scene unfolding confirmed everything she already believed about people who did not look expensive enough. Brandon folded his hands behind his back with the confidence of a man convinced he had restored order to his perfect hotel. This does not need to become more uncomfortable than it already is, he said smoothly. Evelyn looked at him for several seconds before answering. No, she replied softly. It did not. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Even Brandon's smile faded slightly. Frank reached the front desk area and stopped beside Evelyn. Ma'am, he said quietly, almost apologetically, I am going to have to ask you to come with me. Evelyn gave him a small nod. Of course. No anger. No pleading. No humiliation visible on her face. Somehow that made the atmosphere inside the Beaumont Grand even more uneasy. Lena Brooks watched from behind the counter with growing panic twisting in her chest. The strange reservation note still burned in her mind. Executive ownership, circle clearance required. She had never seen those words attached to any guest before. Her instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong, but Brandon's presence dominated the room like a wall nobody dared challenge. Evelyn slowly reached down for the handle of her suitcase. As she lifted it, a small leather card holder slipped briefly from the outer pocket and hit the marble floor near the counter. Lena instinctively bent down to pick it up before Brandon noticed. The moment she opened it, her breath caught. Inside was a simple cream-colored card embossed with dark silver lettering. Harper Global Capital. Beneath the name was a title. Chief Executive Officer. Lena's pulse quickened instantly. She knew the company. Everyone in New York's luxury business world knew the company. Harper Global Capital owned portions of commercial towers, private aviation firms, and entire hospitality portfolios across the country. Before Lena could speak, Evelyn gently took the card holder back from her hand. Their eyes met for one brief moment. Evelyn's expression remained calm, but there was something strangely compassionate in it, as though she understood exactly why Lena stayed silent. "Thank you," Evelyn said softly. Then she turned toward the lobby entrance. Rain continued pouring outside beyond the towering glass doors, while passing headlights reflected across the wet Manhattan streets. Frank walked beside her carefully, almost embarrassed to be part of what was happening. Brandon remained standing behind the front desk with his chin slightly raised, determined to appear victorious in front of the guests surrounding him. Then Evelyn stopped walking just before reaching the revolving doors. The entire lobby seemed to pause again. She looked back toward Brandon one final time. "Luxury becomes meaningless," she said calmly, "when people confuse dignity with appearance." Nobody answered. Even the piano music had stopped completely now. Brandon forced a tight smile, but uncertainty had finally begun creeping into his eyes. Evelyn gave a small nod to Frank, then stepped out into the cold Manhattan rain alone while the massive glass doors slowly closed behind her, leaving the Beaumont Grand strangely quieter than before. Cold rain swept across West 57th Street as Evelyn Harper stepped away from the glowing entrance of the Beaumont Grand. Behind the towering glass windows, the hotel still shimmered with gold light and polished luxury, but outside, Manhattan felt colder somehow. Water rolled across the sidewalks beneath the streetlights while yellow taxis cut through the night like streaks of blurred color. Evelyn stopped beneath the edge of the awning beside her old brown suitcase and looked up once at the illuminated hotel sign above her. For a moment, her calm expression softened with something deeper than disappointment. Memory. 7 years earlier, she had stood in almost the same spot beside her father on the night the Beaumont Grand reopened after financial collapse. Back then, the hotel had been weeks from bankruptcy. Employees feared losing their jobs. Investors had vanished. Her father had believed the hotel deserved to survive because it represented something rare in New York: quiet elegance without cruelty. Evelyn had used her own company to quietly finance the rescue deal that saved the Beaumont brand from disappearing forever. But her father never lived long enough to see what the hotel became afterward. Tonight would have been his 75th birthday. That was why she came personally instead of sending assistants or executives. Not for business, not for power, just memory. She slowly removed a silver pocket watch from her coat and glanced at the engraved initials on the back. Thomas Harper. The metal had worn smooth after decades of use. Her father used to tell her the same thing every time they traveled together. You can measure people by how they treat strangers when nobody important is watching. Evelyn closed the watch quietly and slipped it back into her pocket. Behind her, the revolving doors opened again. Lena Brooks hurried outside without an umbrella, clutching her coat tightly against the rain. "Miss Harper," she called nervously. Evelyn turned. Lena stopped a few feet away, clearly unsure whether she even had the right to approach her. Raindrops clung to her hair, while guilt filled her expression. "I am so sorry," Lena said softly. What happened in there was wrong. Evelyn studied the young receptionist for a moment. Unlike the others inside the hotel, Lena looked genuinely shaken by what she had witnessed. "You tried to warn yourself," Evelyn replied calmly. Lena frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Evelyn gave a faint smile. "Most people ignore their conscience long before they ignore other people." The rain continued falling around them while traffic hummed through the Manhattan night. Lena lowered her eyes. "I should have spoken up." "Perhaps," Evelyn said gently. "But kindness survives in small decisions first." The words hit Lena harder than any criticism could have. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Lena finally asked the question burning in her mind since the reservation screen appeared. "Who are you really?" Evelyn glanced once toward the glowing windows of the Beaumont Grand. Inside, silhouettes moved beneath chandeliers, completely unaware of how close the night stood to changing. "Someone your manager should have recognized without needing a title," she answered quietly. Before Lena could respond, a deep engine sound rolled through the rainy street nearby. Both women turned instinctively. One black luxury sedan appeared at the corner first, then another, then 3 more behind it. Their headlights cut through the rain as they slowed toward the entrance of the Beaumont Grand in perfect formation. The atmosphere on the sidewalk changed instantly. Even the hotel doorman straightened in confusion. Lena stared at the approaching vehicles while her pulse began rising again. Evelyn simply rested one hand on the handle of her suitcase and watched the convoy arrive with the calm stillness of someone who had been expecting it all along. The line of black luxury sedans came to a smooth stop beneath the glowing entrance of the Beaumont Grand, while rain rolled across their polished surfaces in silver streams. The engines remained running softly, deep and controlled, instantly changing the rhythm of the street outside the hotel. The doorman straightened his jacket at once. Inside the lobby, several guests drifted closer to the windows, curiosity spreading through the building like a quiet current. Lena Brooks stood frozen beside Evelyn Harper beneath the awning while Frank Delaney glanced uneasily toward the arriving vehicles. Then the rear door of the first sedan opened. An older man stepped out holding a dark umbrella against the rain. His silver hair was neatly combed, his charcoal overcoat perfectly tailored, and despite his age, there was something unmistakably commanding in the way he moved. Charles Beaumont rarely appeared in public unexpectedly, but anyone connected to Manhattan luxury hospitality knew his face immediately. Lena felt her stomach drop the moment she recognized him. The owner of the Beaumont Grand walked directly through the rain without hesitation, followed closely by two executive assistants and another man carrying a leather portfolio case. The doorman hurried to greet him, visibly nervous. "Good evening, Mr. Beaumont," he stammered. Charles barely acknowledged him. His eyes had already found Evelyn standing quietly beneath the awning with one hand resting on her suitcase handle. For the first time that night, emotion crossed Evelyn's otherwise calm expression. Not surprise. Familiarity. Charles stopped a few feet in front of her while rain tapped steadily against the umbrella above him. "Ms. Harper," he said respectfully, "I deeply apologize for this disgraceful situation." Lena stopped breathing for a second. Even Frank looked stunned. Evelyn gave a small nod. "Good evening, Charles." No title, no explanation. Yet the simplicity of the exchange carried more weight than anything that had happened all night. Behind the glass lobby doors, Brandon Whitmore noticed the commotion outside and stepped closer to the entrance with growing confusion. The moment he recognized Charles Beaumont standing in the rain speaking directly to Evelyn Harper, the color slowly drained from his face. Charles turned toward the hotel entrance without another word and walked inside. The lobby immediately fell silent as guests realized who had entered the building. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses lowered. Even the piano player quietly removed his hands from the keys. Brandon forced himself to smile as Charles approached the front desk. "Mr. Beaumont," he said quickly, "I did not realize you were arriving tonight." Charles removed his gloves slowly, his expression unreadable. "Clearly," he replied. Brandon glanced nervously toward the entrance where Evelyn still stood outside beside Lena and Frank. "There appears to have been some confusion regarding a guest," Brandon explained carefully. Charles looked at him for several long seconds without speaking. The silence became unbearable almost immediately. Several employees lowered their eyes. Then Charles placed one hand flat against the marble front desk. 7 years ago," he said quietly, "this hotel would have closed permanently without the intervention of Harper Global Capital." Brandon's confident posture began collapsing inch by inch. Lena watched from outside through the glass doors while realization spread across her face. Charles continued speaking in the same calm tone. "Every chandelier in this lobby remained lit because Evelyn Harper chose to save this company when nobody else would." Brandon blinked rapidly now. "Sir, I did not know." Charles cut him off with a glance sharp enough to silence the entire room. "That," he said coldly, "is exactly the problem." The revolving doors slowly turned again as Evelyn finally stepped back into the lobby. Rainwater shimmered beneath her shoes while every eye in the Beaumont Grand fixed on her at once. Brandon stared at her now with open disbelief, the earlier arrogance completely gone from his face. Evelyn said nothing. She simply stood there quietly while the room absorbed the truth piece by piece. Then Charles Beaumont looked directly at Brandon Whitmore and spoke the sentence that made the entire lobby hold its breath. "You removed the woman who owns more of this hotel than I do." The silence inside the Beaumont Grand no longer felt awkward. It felt historical. Every employee behind the marble front desk stood frozen while guests stared openly at Evelyn Harper with entirely different eyes now. Only minutes earlier, some of them had watched her with amusement. Now nobody seemed willing to even whisper. Brandon Whitmore remained motionless beside the counter, his face pale beneath the chandelier light. His confidence had collapsed so quickly it almost looked unreal. He glanced from Evelyn to Charles Beaumont and back again, as though hoping someone would suddenly explain away what he had just heard. But nobody did. Charles removed his rain-speckled overcoat slowly and handed it to an assistant without taking his eyes off Brandon. "Ms. Harper has quietly protected this company for years," he said evenly. "Most people in this building still have jobs because of decisions she made when the Beaumont organization was collapsing." A low murmur spread through the lobby. Several employees exchanged stunned looks. Even the wealthy couple near the elevator looked visibly uncomfortable now. Brandon swallowed hard. "Sir, I was following standard procedures." Evelyn finally spoke before Charles could answer. "No," she said calmly. "You were following assumptions." The sentence landed softly, but the weight behind it pressed across the room like stone. Brandon opened his mouth again, struggling to recover authority. "I did not recognize you." Evelyn looked at him quietly. That was never the problem. Lena Brooks felt tears burning behind her eyes now. The memory of Evelyn standing alone in the rain outside the hotel suddenly felt unbearable. She stepped forward nervously from behind the desk. "Mr. Beaumont," she said softly, "I saw the reservation clearance earlier." Charles turned toward her. Lena gathered her courage. "It was marked Executive Ownership Circle. I should have said something sooner." Brandon closed his eyes briefly as realization fully settled over him. Charles studied Lena for a moment before nodding once. "You noticed what mattered," he replied. Evelyn looked toward Lena with the same calm kindness she had shown outside. "Most people remain silent because they are afraid," Evelyn said gently. "Character begins when someone notices injustice at all." The room grew still again. Somewhere in the lobby, a glass softly touched marble as a bartender quietly set it down. Brandon's breathing had become shallow now. "Ms. Harper," he began carefully, "if I had known who you were—" Evelyn interrupted him softly. "Would you have treated me differently?" Brandon could not answer, and that silence answered everything. Charles walked slowly toward the center of the lobby, turning just enough for the surrounding guests and employees to hear him clearly. "The irony," he said quietly, "is that Ms. Harper specifically requested no special treatment tonight." Several people looked shocked. Charles continued. "She has refused public recognition from this company for 7 years. She rejected press interviews, declined naming rights, and personally funded employee healthcare expansion during the pandemic without allowing her name attached to it." Lena stared at Evelyn in disbelief. Frank Delaney lowered his eyes respectfully. Even the wealthy woman who had mocked Evelyn earlier could no longer meet her gaze. Brandon looked physically smaller, now standing beneath the chandeliers he once used to measure everyone else. Evelyn finally picked up her old brown suitcase again. "My father believed luxury meant making people feel welcome before asking who they were," she said quietly. "That belief mattered more to me than this hotel ever did." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The entire Beaumont Grand seemed suspended inside the weight of her words. Then something subtle changed in the room. Employees who had ignored her earlier now stepped aside instinctively as Evelyn walked across the marble floor. Guests lowered their voices. Bellmen straightened their posture. Respect spread naturally through the lobby without being demanded. Brandon watched all of it happen with hollow eyes as the truth settled fully around him. The woman he had treated like an embarrassment had entered the hotel with more grace, influence, and dignity than anyone else in the building. And for the first time that night, nobody looked at Brandon Whitmore with admiration anymore. Rain still tapped softly against the towering glass windows of the Beaumont Grand while nobody inside the lobby seemed willing to speak above a whisper anymore. The atmosphere had completely transformed. Earlier that evening, Evelyn Harper had stood alone beneath the chandeliers while strangers judged her appearance. Now employees instinctively stepped aside whenever she moved through the marble lobby, not out of fear, but respect. Charles Beaumont slowly turned toward Brandon Whitmore, whose hands now rested stiffly against the front desk as though he needed something solid to keep himself standing. "Effective immediately," Charles said calmly. "You are relieved of managerial authority pending a full executive review. Brandon lowered his eyes. There was no argument left in him now. The humiliation on his face no longer came from exposure alone. It came from understanding. "I understand," he said quietly. Charles nodded once. "Security will escort you to the executive office tomorrow morning for formal processing." Frank Delaney shifted uncomfortably nearby, clearly saddened by how quickly the night had unraveled. Brandon had spent years building his reputation at the Beaumont Grand, but in one evening, the image he protected so aggressively had collapsed under the weight of his own assumptions. Yet Evelyn stepped forward before the silence could harden into cruelty. "There will be no public spectacle," she said softly. Charles glanced at her carefully. Evelyn continued, "People learn more from accountability than humiliation." Several employees exchanged surprised looks. Even Brandon slowly raised his head. Evelyn turned toward the staff gathered behind the front desk. "No employee should ever fear losing their dignity because they cannot afford expensive clothing or because they arrive alone," she said calmly. "That includes guests and staff alike." The words spread through the lobby with quiet force. Lena Brooks felt tears gathering in her eyes again. Charles nodded thoughtfully. "Then we will revise hospitality training across every Beaumont property," he announced. "Effective immediately." He looked toward Lena next. "And Ms. Brooks." Lena straightened nervously. "Yes, sir. You showed more integrity tonight than most executives do in 20 years. Lena looked stunned. Charles gave a faint nod. "Starting tomorrow morning, you will report directly to Executive Guest Relations." Lena covered her mouth briefly in disbelief, while several employees nearby smiled quietly for the first time all evening. Evelyn gave her a small, encouraging nod. "Do not lose your conscience just because your title changes," she said gently. "That is how places begin forgetting people." Lena nodded immediately. "I will not." Near the elevators, the wealthy woman who had mocked Evelyn earlier slowly approached with visible embarrassment. "Ms. Harper," she said awkwardly, "I owe you an apology." Evelyn looked at her kindly, but without resentment. "Perhaps," she replied softly, "you owe one to the next person society overlooks." The woman lowered her eyes, unable to answer. The lesson settled across the room deeper than any punishment could have. Meanwhile, Brandon remained near the front desk watching everything unfold around him. What disturbed him most was not losing authority. It was realizing how differently the room responded to Evelyn's power compared to his own. Brandon had controlled people through status and intimidation. Evelyn influenced people through calmness, restraint, and dignity. That difference suddenly felt enormous. Charles walked toward Evelyn once more. "Your suite is ready whenever you wish," he said respectfully. Evelyn glanced around the lobby one final time. The same marble floors, the same chandeliers, the same people. Yet the room itself somehow felt changed now. Softer, more honest. As she began walking toward the elevators, bellmen straightened immediately, guests moved aside quietly, and employees nodded to her with sincere respect. No one stared anymore. No one whispered. Brandon watched her disappear beneath the golden elevator lights while one painful truth settled fully into his chest at last. The woman he tried hardest to remove from the Beaumont Grand had been the very reason the hotel still existed at all. By the time midnight settled over Manhattan, the atmosphere inside the Beaumont Grand had become almost unrecognizable from the tension and arrogance that filled it earlier that evening. The marble lobby remained glowing beneath crystal chandeliers, but now conversations were quieter, movements gentler, and every employee carried themselves with unusual care. Near the executive elevator, Evelyn Harper finally stepped into the penthouse suite that had originally been prepared for her arrival. The room overlooked the rain-covered skyline of New York, where thousands of lights shimmered against the dark glass towers beyond Central Park. For several long moments, she simply stood near the window holding the silver pocket watch that once belonged to her father. Tonight had never been about luxury. It had been about memory, about whether the values he believed in had survived inside the place they once saved together. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Evelyn opened the suite door to find Lena Brooks standing nervously in the hallway, holding a small box wrapped in dark ribbon. "I hope I am not disturbing you," Lena said quietly. Evelyn gave a faint smile. "Not at all." Lena stepped inside carefully and handed her the box. "The kitchen prepared this after Mr. Beaumont spoke with them." Evelyn slowly opened it. Inside sat a single slice of old-fashioned chocolate cake with one candle beside it. No elaborate decoration. No luxury presentation. Just simple kindness. Lena looked embarrassed. Mr. Beaumont said someone mentioned it was your father's birthday. For the first time all night, genuine emotion touched Evelyn's eyes completely. She looked down at the cake for several quiet seconds before answering softly. He would have loved this. Lena smiled faintly. The pastry chef said your father used to order the same dessert every year after the reopening gala. Evelyn looked surprised. He remembers that? Apparently, everyone who worked here back then remembers your father, Lena replied. They said he treated employees like family. The room fell quiet again, but this silence felt warm instead of heavy. Evelyn lit the candle slowly and stood by the window overlooking Manhattan while rain continued sliding across the glass. Thank you, Lena, she said softly. You reminded me tonight that good people still exist inside this building. Lena lowered her eyes modestly. You gave me a chance to become one. Downstairs, Brandon Whitmore remained alone inside the darkened executive office. His jacket rested folded across a chair now, and the confidence he once wore so naturally had vanished completely. The city lights reflected dimly through the office windows while he replayed every moment from the night in his mind. The assumptions, the smirks, the way Evelyn Harper stood calmly while he measured her worth by appearance alone. A quiet knock came at the office door. Brandon looked up to find Evelyn standing there alone. He rose immediately, stunned she had come personally. Ms. Harper, he began. Evelyn stepped inside calmly. I came because people rarely learn when conversations end in humiliation, she said softly. Brandon swallowed hard. I owe you an apology. Yes, Evelyn replied gently. He looked down at the floor for several seconds before speaking again. I built my entire career believing luxury meant protecting exclusivity, he admitted quietly. Tonight, I realized I stopped seeing people long ago. Evelyn studied him calmly. Then perhaps tonight was valuable after all. Brandon's voice lowered. I am truly sorry. There was no excuse left in his words now. Only honesty. Evelyn gave a small nod. What matters is whether you remember this feeling when someone powerless stands in front of you again someday. Brandon slowly sat back down, unable to meet her eyes fully. The lesson had finally reached deeper than punishment ever could. Evelyn turned toward the office door, pausing briefly before leaving. My father once told me something, she said quietly. The easiest way to recognize true class is to watch how someone treats the person who cannot offer them anything. Then she walked out into the quiet hallway while the lights of Manhattan glowed softly beyond the windows. And that night, everyone inside the Beaumont Grand remembered that dignity is never proven by wealth, only by the humility to recognize it in others.